rights stuff for probably over a decade, and both here and briefly in Ireland, which I visited earlier on this year. I'm here today to talk, as Giovanni said, about the refugee issue in Australia, and particularly in the context of the looming CHOGM meeting that we've got happening next weekend. There was actually a lot of stuff written in yesterday's West Australian about CHOGM, and I will allude to that, and also stuff on the CHOGM website as well. A lot of that actually stuff talks about economics, I mean, not surprisingly, with the global financial crisis. And one thing actually caught my eye is Julia Gillard yesterday on the front page of the West actually had the temerity to say, Perth's CHOGM would transform the Commonwealth into a major diplomatic force, united in demanding European leaders stop muddling through their sovereign debt crisis and solve it. They're just like that. Just like that. And I just thought, oh my God, I'm sure Andrea Merkel is you know, soundly rebuked now that Julia Gillard's actually turned around and told her what to do. And it boggles the mind. I mean, I don't know, maybe something's gone to Julia Gillard's head, but Australia's economic miracle, so-called, is based on a great big hole in the ground and getting the contact to that hole and selling it to China. It's not rocket science, and it's far more tenuous than a lot of people want to admit. But sorry, I digress. I'm not actually here to talk about economics. I'm here to talk about human rights. But you might just want to remember Julia Gillard's lecturing later on when I talk about a few things later on. I want to say a few things about the Commonwealth as an organisation. Let me just read something from the CHOGM website. Wonderful resource if anyone wants to go there. The Commonwealth, with roots back as far as the 1870s, believes in establishing partnerships between governments, business and civil society to build stronger democratic institutions and procedures. That apparently is what the Commonwealth is all about. But as an historian, which is what I actually am, I find that actually quite a remarkable statement. The Commonwealth with roots back as far back as 1870s, with democratic credentials as far back as that. It's probably worth remembering that back in the 1870s it wasn't the Commonwealth, it was the British Empire. And a lot of the states that made up that British Empire, that fell under that rather bloody umbrella of the British Empire, weren't actually there because they felt a warm, fuzzy feeling about the monarch. They weren't there because they felt good about the imperial centre. They were actually there because they were helped there by Britain's armed forces. Back particularly in Tony Blair's time, there were a lot of historians around trying to actually put a sort of a civilising gloss on the British Empire. But from my point of view, as somebody who actually, funnily enough, does Irish history next to the Fisher, far from having a spotless record of its dealings with its colonies, Britain actually has a pretty blood-soaked record. It's fought a number of vicious colonial wars to either keep states in its orbit or to establish states that it found acceptable. And unfortunately, a lot of those states have seemed to learn from their colonial masters, and they can exercise the kind of political ruthlessness that might have been taught to them by their masters in the UK. And the reason I mention this is that I think it actually matters how a thing was born. And so it matters that we remember where the Commonwealth comes from. And also it matters because the UK in particular, at least ostensibly, are one of the leaders of the Commonwealth, and really they haven't set much of a shining example for the rest of the member states. I also think it's important to recall this history because it's something of an antidote to the spin and the kind of festive hoopla that we're hearing about CHOGM. Oh, we're going to have a lovely festival. You know, as we wave our glossy flag at the Queen who's driving past in her motorcade and all this stuff, a flag nicely supplied by the West Australian yesterday. Lovely thing. I would have brought it tonight, but my housemate ripped it up. I don't know why. Let's talk about the Commonwealth today. Today, the Commonwealth organisation likes to talk about its shared values. It likes to say things like, we solemnly reiterate our commitment to the Commonwealth's core values. I had to actually look quite hard to find what their core values were, but I did find them, and they are meant to be a force for peace, democracy, equality and good governance. They're meant to be a catalyst for global consensus building. Now, I had to think about that. I know what you mean, like the consensus that we're all going to go to war against Iraq. That kind of sense. I'm not sure. They want to be a source of assistance for sustainable development. I thought, oh, that sounds nice. And they want to eradicate poverty. I reckon they want to start on that one pretty soon. It all sounds really nice, but I mean, clearly, you know, they're all pretty tenuous claims for the Commonwealth to make. I actually went to the CHOGM website again and I looked at the theme paper for this year's CHOGM meeting, and in that they say they're going to be there, they're going to be meeting there to build more resilient democracies and develop partnerships which deliver education, training and technical assistance to promote good governance and human rights. Like a commitment to human rights relies on technical assistance. What, are they going to ask Serco to help with that, are they? For people who don't know, Serco are the private prison company that runs Australia's immigration detention centres. Is that who they're going to turn to for technical assistance in human rights? See, the problem is, it all sounds very nice. It all sounds very nice. But an internal report that was actually commissioned by the Commonwealth Organisation itself to map a path to Commonwealth reform, compiled by former Australian High Court Justice Michael Kirby, actually charges the Commonwealth with failing to live up to these values. In yesterday's West, Steve Pennells wrote an opinion column where he said, Perth's role as CHOGM host was rooted in human rights 2 years ago when concerns over abuses by Sri Lanka basically led to Perth taking over the job as host. They didn't want to have it in Sri Lanka, they thought they'd have it here. And I thought about this and I thought, oh, you know, I'm wondering about Australia's human rights credentials. Rajapaksa and his gang of thugs unambiguously carried out a war of genocide against the Tamil people for decades. But I do think that Australia shouldn't be too complacent or self-righteous when actually, you know, thinks about these things. When actually, to be honest with you, Australia's condemnation of Sri Lanka has been so mooted that I think they definitely want to basically not be too self-righteous about it because they haven't bloody said anything. And also I think they need to not be self-righteous about it because, as a few people have said here tonight, they've had their own red-hot go at genocide themselves. Malcolm Fraser also wrote an article yesterday in the West, and his is perhaps a little bit more interesting. Fraser has been lauded in some circles of the refugee movement for his more humane attitude to refugees. And I have to give credit where credit's due. He has got a more humane attitude to refugees, and he should be congratulated for that. He does actually suffer from historical myopia. In the article, he says, no country has ever voluntarily wanted to withdraw from the Commonwealth. Ireland in 1949 declared itself to be a republic and withdrew from the Commonwealth, and I'm pretty sure they did that voluntarily. He also describes Botswana as a quiet, multi-party democracy that has governed its affairs well, and I know that Botswana has restrictions on press freedom and the right to strike and various other things, but perhaps because Malcolm Fraser doesn't understand what a multi-party democracy is, he gets confused. Fraser, bless his cotton socks, is a liberal conservative, a conservative liberal, whatever you want to think of him as, so you've got to probably cut him a little bit of slack. He's not the same kind of person, not cut from the same sort of jib that the big C conservatives who stalk around the Liberal Party now are cut from. And his article actually does go on to make some pretty laudable, if from my point of view, too restrained suggestions regarding the Commonwealth and refugees. And he said this. He said, the Commonwealth could spearhead efforts for all recipient countries to take more refugees from UNHCR camps around the world and reduce the numbers in those camps. And he also went on to say that the Commonwealth should pay more attention to the UN Convention on the Status of Refugees. I actually think Australia should pay some attention to that convention, seeing as they signed it. But, you know, Malcolm Fraser is entirely correct in those points that he makes. He actually sees the Commonwealth as being a force for good in the world. And here comes the controversial bit that I'm going to say, because I actually think the Commonwealth has very much had its day, if it ever had a day at all. I tend to think, how can an organisation like the Commonwealth, which is shot through with member states that themselves violate human rights, that prosecute genocidal wars, that are corrupt, that agree on only one thing, and that's the neoliberal commitment to keeping things safe for profit-making and international corporations, not for their citizens. They'll keep things safe for banks, and they'll keep things safe for mining, and they'll keep things safe for agribusiness. They are not keeping things safe for their own citizens. How can you actually look to an organisation like that to champion human rights? And specifically in the case of Australia, whose own human rights record is so lamentable, how can it lecture the rest of the Commonwealth on human rights abuses? When Gillard was elected PM, one of the first things out of her mouth was that she understood the anxieties of people worried about refugees coming by boat. Really? Because I can't understand those anxieties. They're actually profoundly ill-informed anxieties. They're actually xenophobic anxieties. And if Gillard was a leader's toenail, she would have stood up and said, there is no flood of refugees, there is no threat from these people. For those who come across the seas, we've boundless plains to share. But she didn't say that. She did not say that. Instead, her government has actually presided over a continuation of a system that's characterised by its punitive measures against people exercising a human right to seek asylum. Gillard talks about disrupting the people smugglers' business model. I love this. That's nonsense. That's absolute nonsense. If she actually wants to stem the flow of refugees, perhaps she should talk to her CHOGM colleague Rajapaksa, who's implicated in war crimes against Tamils. Or she could talk to her Pakistani colleague, whose ISI security agency has been pinged for sponsoring terrorism in India and Afghanistan. And part of that terrorism is that they target Hazara people in both of those countries. Tamils and Hazaras make up a huge amount of the refugees who unfortunately land on our shores. She's done nothing along those lines. She has no right to lecture anyone on human rights abuses until her own government gets its house in order. The stymieing of offshore processing, which we saw last week, and I think people should recognise that it was achieved through no great exercise of political principle on the part of either of the major parties, that should not reassure us, because the government hasn't moved away from detention being a part of their refugee policy. It's stumbled and mumbled its way into some rhetorical commitment to community detention, whatever that means. That's something we should view with the utmost suspicion. In all likelihood, that's going to be mismanaged, it's going to be underfunded, and it's going to be finally dumped in the laps of NGOs who've already got way too much on their plates. I don't think we should feel in any way confident about where this government's going with its refugee policy. We need to be clear, the fight is not over in Australia for the rights of refugees. And we cannot go hat in hand to the likes of Gillard or CHOGM, not hat in hand. There's a sting in the tail here. Like every meaningful social reform that's ever been enacted, we need to generate pressure from below to demand a humane system for refugees. That's why today I'd urge you all to actually look at the stuff on the back of the stall, wave your hand there, and join in the actual actions that are planned for the CHOGM weekend. There's a united march on CHOGM on Friday, and the Refugee Rights Action Network has actually also called an action for the Saturday out of the Perth Immigration Detention Centre. Clearly, we can see something, if you read the news, if you watch the television, we can see something is happening on our planet today, and it's not all bad. We've seen the Arab Spring, and we've seen the Occupy move, which I think, for me, I find really inspiring, because it actually puts ordinary people, grassroots people, working people, except in the US and Europe they're actually not working, which is half the problem, but call them what you will, it's put the people back in the driver's seat of politics. They are now the focus of politics in a way that perhaps they weren't 5 years ago. And I think that's a great thing for us, because it means that we can actually look at bringing our political leaders to account, and together we can actually demand from them a real commitment to human rights, rights for refugees and rights for everyone. If there's one opportunity that I think CHOGM presents us with, it's the opportunity for us to actually get up and make ourselves heard to our political leaders, because it's actually us that will lead the real struggle for human rights, starting here and moving across the globe. It's us, it's not the CHOGM elites. Thank you.